Welcome to Legal AF with Court Accountability Action. I'm Mike Sachs, joined by my wonderful, amazing, profoundly intelligent colleague, Lisa Graves. And we are here to talk about the attempt to steal a seat on the North Carolina Supreme Court. Now, you may or may not have heard about this since we've been talking about this whole issue for months now, because since the November election, a Republican candidate for the North Carolina Supreme Court, backed by the entire Republican apparatus in North Carolina, up to and including the Republican-dominated Supreme Court of North Carolina, has been trying to steal an election from Justice Allison Riggs, a sitting member of the Supreme Court, who won her statewide vote by 734 votes. And the way they tried to steal it, yeah, right, Lisa. I mean, it was crazy. And the way that Griffin tried to steal it was he said, hey, throw out some 60,000 votes, please. Just like cancel 60,000 votes. He didn't even try to say, okay, maybe like 735 votes we can try to throw out. No, he tried to get 60,000 North Carolina voters disenfranchised, whom he would have never tried to do had he won by even one vote.
Right.
But just this week, Lisa, we saw that Griffin finally stood down. But it wasn't without a lot of drama, a lot of struggle, and a lot of anti-democratic efforts that got us to this point. So Lisa, can you fill us in on what was the final straw that got Griffin to stand down?
Well, I do want to talk about that because it was a federal court that intervened, and I want to toss that back to you. But before we get there, I just want to say, just to underscore what you said, Mike, my wonderful, amazing, brilliant colleague here, and please do subscribe and share these videos because this work together and along with these amazing allies in North Carolina, it really has been transformative in the face of a really outrageous and I wouldn't say unprecedented, but very rare circumstance, but hopefully rare going forward, which we'll talk about. But the fact is that this guy, this sitting state court judge, did everything he could to disqualify votes from predominantly Democratic counties, along with votes from people serving in the military abroad. And he was aided and abetted by numerous Republican officials in the state of North Carolina, including some fellow judges, but not all. And so this case had a circuitous path, both in the federal courts and the state courts, until finally a federal district court, and a circuit court, which is the appellate court level, said, no, we are not going to entertain. Now we're 5 months past that election, this effort to disqualify voters who were allowed to vote by Republican and Democratic election officials, and to cancel their voices, to cancel their votes, and to do so just to help this guy win, where he was targeting Democratic voters to do so. It's just an outrage that this went on this long, but I'm so grateful for the Republican and Democratic appointees to the federal courts who stood up to the brazen effort by Republican elected officials in that state to try to steal this seat.
And Lisa, we need to get into why they tried to steal it in the first place. And this takes a little bit of history to go into over the past few years. So as soon as the Supreme Court, U.S. Supreme Court, gutted the Voting Rights Act in 2013 in the case of Shelby County versus Holder, a bunch of states moved forward with voter suppression laws and then moved forward with extreme partisan gerrymandering that the Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court, said they had no power to police under our Constitution. But state courts were able to do so. And a few years ago, the North Carolina Supreme Court had a 4-3, and correct me if I'm wrong if that was the number, but had a majority of Democratic appointees who believed in our democracy and a representative democracy where their state should be fairly represented. And then whoever wins under a fairly represented legislative map. Well, that state Supreme Court, I'll call them SCONC, Supreme Court of North Carolina. That Democratic majority SCONC struck down North Carolina's extreme partisan gerrymandered maps that were put forward by the gerrymandered Republican majority in the state of North Carolina, struck those down as unconstitutional under the state's constitution. A bunch of stuff happened after that. They got to the U.S. Supreme Court. We'll just sort of put that aside for a moment. It'll be a whole other segment for that. But then another election came, and Republicans won their statewide judicial elections for the state Supreme Court under the voter suppression law that had been passed in North Carolina. But at least the extreme partisan gerrymandering wasn't included in a statewide vote. And then what happened, Lisa? We know what happened. That flipped Supreme Court, state Supreme Court, then went back to that old case about the extreme partisan gerrymandering and said, no, those maps are actually okay now. Those maps are okay now. And we're going to ensure that then this Republican legislature can pass a whole bunch of laws that take power away from the statewide elected Democratic governor and attorney general and take power away from those officials to appoint members to the Board of Elections in North Carolina.
Yeah.
And then we as Skunk, the Republican-controlled Skunk, is going to make sure that even fairly elected Democrats cannot win and cannot have their policy preferences moving forward through all these anti-democratic efforts to stack the system, the legislative and judicial system in the state against them, locking themselves in perpetual power. So that's the background, Lisa, right? I mean, I don't think I missed anything, but if I did, let's keep going.
Well, you didn't, but I would just say, to emphasize that point, this was a state Supreme Court that was the previous state Supreme Court was elected on a nonpartisan basis. Yeah. And one of the things that the Republican legislature did when they captured that legislature was change those rules to make it harder for North Carolinians to vote and to pack them into different districts to make it easier for them to have a Republican majority, regardless of whether a Democrat could win a statewide race, including a Supreme Court race. And so that state Supreme Court that issued that ruling, striking down that extreme partisan gerrymandering, their fact-finding was amazing. It was such a compelling case, and they were relying on longstanding precedent. And then it is truly extraordinary for a new Supreme Court just a year later, basically 2 years later in total, to come through because they have a different majority, a different Republican packed majority, in essence, elected in partisan races, to say they're going to overturn recent precedent of that court, a well-reasoned ruling of that court. And so it was a naked political act by the people who took over that court. And then, in essence, they've been determined, with one exception, one Republican elected official on that Supreme Court, with one exception, it appeared that they had been determined to basically keep as many Republicans on that court as possible, to try to have a 6-1 Republican to Democratic, to deny even 2 seats to be held by judges who now have to run in a partisan race as Democrats. And
I want to get into those numbers as well, because right now, when the race began, and now that it's over, it's a 5-2 Republican majority on the North Carolina Supreme Court. In order to get a Democratic majority on the North Carolina Supreme Court again, that could set about banning extreme partisan gerrymandering in the state again, making sure that the elected that the democracy meddling legislation coming out of the extreme partisan gerrymandered legislature in North Carolina gets put away and put back where it should be, which is never in a representative democratic state. In order to get to that, the Democratic candidates would have to win a clean sweep through 2028 to retain the other Democratic justice's seat, Anita Earls, and also to beat the three of the 4 Republicans in this specific case of Riggs versus Griffin that voted to steal the election from Riggs. In other words, in order to get to a 4-3 majority to restore democracy to its fullest extent in North Carolina, again, to benefit whomever wins. This isn't for Democrats or for Republicans. It's for North Carolina's democracy. In order to restore that, the Democratic candidates would have to win a clean sweep of 4 straight elections between now and in 2026 and 2028. So the Republicans on the current Supreme Court of North Carolina, with one exception, all said, well, we're going to do our best to make sure that that difficulty will be as difficult as possible.
Well, that's right. And they were
Yeah.
aided by these outside money groups, these just this ABC, alphabet soup sort of groups claiming that they're for North Carolina or better North Carolina or whatever. All this dark money sloshing around to try to accomplish what Justice Earls described in her dissenting opinion as a bloodless coup. To execute a coup to capture that court and keep that court in place, like you said, for the reasons of trying to make sure North Carolinians do not claw back their voting rights to the maximum extent, to make sure that their votes don't get canceled by losing Republicans, to make sure that they have a fair chance of having the people in the legislature actually represent them. Because in North Carolina, like Wisconsin, what we've seen is Republicans can win these races where they've written the map so that they win. But at a statewide level for the governor and the attorney general, that Democrats can win when there isn't interference in the maps. They don't always win, but at least it's a fair shot at winning. And so, this case really is a sort of a trial balloon for the sort of election denialism of Donald Trump. Jefferson Griffin is like cut from that same cloth, but he's not alone. We've seen some of those machinations in other places, and this idea that a Republican candidate can go in and basically select Democratic counties in order to stop votes from being counted or basically disenfranchise people, have Republican judges at the highest level allow that. That is the playbook for Arizona, possibly in 2026 or 2028. And here we've had a situation where this has dragged on for 5 months. What happens if these Republicans try to execute this really horrible election, like democracy denying plan in those 2026 midterms or the presidential? And so I think we have despite this win for voters in North Carolina have their votes counted, we have an ongoing crisis that this has basically normalized. And I was just going to say, when I looked at Jefferson Griffin's campaign ads from last year, his sort of core ad, he had in the background the famous Dewey beats Truman newspaper headline. The guy who then subsequently basically was Dewey and was trying to steal an election in North Carolina.
Amazing. And now Democrats in North Carolina running for the state Supreme Court have to win 3 out of the next 4 elections in order to get a majority to make sure that democracy becomes representative again. That's the stakes. Those are the stakes.
Yeah.
But as Lisa was saying, this is a playbook that can be repeated across the country. And what we saw was by the grace of and the wisdom and the commitment to our democracy from federal courts in this country, whether it's the Trump-appointed Judge Richard Myers in North Carolina, who earlier on refused to take the case's removal to federal court while working its way through the North Carolina Supreme Courts, which then ultimately did attempt to steal the election for Griffin, or whether it was the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, which earlier on had then said, well, no, Myers, you should take that case back once it works its way all the way through the Supreme Court of North Carolina. So when the Supreme Court of North Carolina did straight up steal the election for Griffin, or tried, it was able to get back to federal court. Myers then said, well, let's continue the cure process, Board of Elections. And the Fourth Circuit said, no, we're not. That doesn't work. And then Myers said, okay, game over. Griffin, you're done. And Griffin didn't appeal. And he said, I'm done. But this playbook can be done again, Lisa. And we need to stay vigilant about that and make sure that this doesn't happen again and cannot win again. Because if it does, in this laboratory of democracy, we don't want them to become, the states become laboratories of anti-democracy, to get to a point where then it'll seep into our federal moment, where just 5 years ago, we had someone try to overturn an election.
Yeah, you are exactly right, my friend. And I'll tell you, reading the local accounts of the reporters on the ground who've done an amazing job of interviewing people whose votes would be canceled or were attempted to be canceled, people are angry at this effort to attack this fundamental right. And I hope that sort of righteous anger carries through going forward, that people understand what the stakes are, that this is a really vile effort to deny Americans one of the most fundamental rights in our democracy, the right that unlocks almost all other rights. And so I join you in, that hope, Mike, that you have so eloquently described, that hope that we do not have these laboratories of democracy turn into laboratories of anti-democracy, or to the extent that they are, that is the attempt, these sorts of coups are attempted, that the people and the fantastic lawyers, really fight back and are determined to make sure that their rights, our rights as Americans, are not defeated by people who only want power and not democracy.
I'll leave you with that, everybody. Lisa Graves. Thank you for watching. Please hit that subscribe button. Record accountability action with Legal AF. See you next time.
Can't get your fill of Legal AF? Me neither. That's why we formed the Legal AF Substack. Every time we mention something in a hot take, whether it's a court filing or a oral argument, come over to the Substack. You'll find the court filing and the oral argument there, including a daily roundup that I do called, wait for it, Morning AF. What else? All the other contributors from Legal AF are there as well. We got some new reporting. We got interviews. We got ad-free versions of the podcast and hot takes. Where? Legal AF on Substack. Come over now to free subscribe.